All right, welcome to RSP Film Theory. Adam Harstad and Matt Waldman. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about value, capital value, and undercase value, and about how that may apply, some of that whole Platonic idealism, and how maybe setting that up to how that applies to real-world examples of how we can leverage value with players in dynasty formats like Patrick Mahomes or Dak Prescott or Justin Jefferson, players like that you can get at a discount oftentimes relative to what we would expect them to be. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Hall of Fame process. Well, maybe not the process, but the players who are, in line to become finalists. Let's put it that way, the semifinalists for the Hall of Fame, both the Veterans Committee and the modern era players. So Adam, everyone can find Adam's work over at Football Guys. You can find Dynasty in Theory there, and we talk a lot about this column each week, and give you a chance to share a little bit more about it to folks who maybe aren't Football Guys subscribers.
Well, yes, this is the Film and Theory podcast, so of course we mentioned the Dynasty in Theory. If we ever start a Film and Kickers podcast, we might have to do my kicker streaming column instead.
That's never going to happen.
We're not. No, there's no
RSP
chance. Film and Kickers podcast.
No, I don't care about kickers. I just don't. But I appreciate that you do.
I was about to say many of them, I'm sure, are wonderful human beings.
Yeah, and like, in terms of humanity, I care about them, but in terms of football, I just defer to you and other folks, and I'm lazy about that.
Okay, hey, fair enough. I honestly think that laziness is one of the most important values in a good fantasy analyst, and I'm not saying that ironically. I think that laziness is one of my big superpowers because it leaves me very motivated to find efficient ways to do things.
Yeah, that's one of those areas that I'll leave to somebody else for sure. The corporate word for that is delegate, right? Or hold on. No, the corporate word for the definition for delegate in corporate America is make someone else do your job. I think that's the when you actually have things that you should be doing and taking credit for it.
I'm not delegating. I'm trying to operationalize my efficiencies. So find some synergies that I can leverage.
Yeah, something like that. Now that you are all thoroughly ready to throw up in your corporate washrooms, we'll be done with that. So, all right. So let's kind of review a little bit of last week and head into this week about how we leverage value with players.
Yeah, so I mentioned last week that I'd kind of been doing like a table setter that we were talking about Platonic idealism, where if you see a triangle, that triangle is not a perfect triangle. Its sides are not perfectly straight. Its angles do not perfectly add up to the exact right amount. It's a representation of this perfect idea of triangleness. And some triangles are going to be better representations of that than others. When my 9-year-old draws a triangle, it's not going to be as precise as if you use AutoCAD to create a triangle. That's going to be a much more precise triangle, but none of them are perfect. And so Plato was saying, let's imagine this universe where there exist these perfect ideals of these words that we're using. And I said, okay, let's apply that Platonic idealism, Platonic realism, to player value in fantasy football. We've all seen real world player values. There's lots of great player value charts. I'm partial to Dan Hendry's work at Football Guys, largely because, like I was saying about the value of laziness, his process is probably most similar to mine among any of the dynasty analysts in the space. So because he does such strong work, and since he does what I would do if I were to do that work myself, I can just not do that work, and I can rely on Hendry to do it for me, which is an amazing asset. But there's also Fantasy Calc, which tracks thousands and thousands of real dynasty leagues, and it will scrape all of the trades that are happening in those leagues and will say, Emeka Egbuka, this is what he's trading for right now. If you were to trade him today based on the thousands and thousands of dynasty leagues and trades involving him that we're seeing, this is his trade value. And so that's another great example of real world value. Keep Trade Cuts, another one I like. Where it's free dynasty rankings, but everybody who visits the page to see the rankings, it asks them to compare 3 players and pick one that you would keep, one that you would trade and one that you would cut. So basically, like, who do you like best, second best, and least among that trio? And then from that, it uses like the old ELO ranking formula to see who like wins the most 3-person matchups and creates values from that. And these are all fantastic real world useful examples of value, but none of them are like the platonic ideal of value, because the platonic ideal of value would incorporate all sorts of things like what are your league mates' trading tendencies, and even things that are like all of these values assume that the only thing you care about is winning championships. But if you're an Ohio State alum, maybe you would rather not roster a Michigan player. Maybe it's not a strong preference, but maybe there's this weak preference where, all else being equal, you would rather have the Ohio State guy than the Michigan guy. And so this platonic ideal of value would incorporate all of these things, and it would have like perfect foreknowledge. We're not guessing at who's good. Platonic ideal value would know who's good and how much longer they have left in their careers. We're not guessing like how many more years is Derrick Henry going to play. A platonic ideal value would know exactly how much longer Derrick Henry is going to play. And once we have this established, that like we have our lowercase v value, and that's what we have in the real world, that's what we're guessing at, that's this rough approximation. And then we have the capital V value, which this is the platonic ideal value. This is what we're trying to get at when we create our lowercase v values. This is what we're trying to mimic and to create in the real world, which is impossible, but that's the goal. We can ask questions like, how does lowercase v value behave differently than capital V value? And one of the biggest things is that lowercase v value, when a player has a big game, his value goes up. We see this with Oronde Gadsden. Oronde Gadsden was valued quite low in rookie drafts. He strings together a couple big games. Now he's ranked very high in tight end rankings. Compare him to somebody like Colston Loveland, who was drafted much higher, both by the NFL and by fantasy players, and who was ranked much higher a month ago. In many cases, people are valuing Oronde Gadsden higher than Colston Loveland. And to some extent, this makes a lot of sense because we don't know how good the players are. And a good game, a huge game, gives us new information that, hey, maybe this player is better than you thought. And as a result, we're raising our estimation of his total career production. And so his value goes up. Makes perfect sense. Platonic ideal value, what happens after a player has a big game, is his value goes down, which is very unintuitive. But if you think about it, if Oronde Gadsden has 10 100-yard games in his career, and then he has one of them, well, after that, he only has 9 100-yard games remaining in his career. There's less future production for you to take advantage of. And so in a perfect universe where we had perfect foreknowledge of how everything was going to play out, a player's value would start at its peak when he first started producing and would decline steadily from there with every bit of production that he had. The bigger the game, the more his value would decline. And again, this makes sense because this is assuming perfect foreknowledge. It makes sense that value goes up after a big game in the real world, lowercase v value, because we're learning new things about a player. But then I pointed out there's some players who we're not really learning new things about after a big game. If Patrick Mahomes has a 4-touchdown performance, we haven't really learned anything new about Patrick Mahomes. We know who he is. We don't think more highly of him after the game than we did before the game. And as a result, Patrick Mahomes is a player who, like, in a perfect world, his value should be declining with production because every big game he has is one fewer big game remaining. But in the real world, what happens is Patrick Mahomes' value stays flat. And because of that, there's this inefficiency where, and I called this like back in 2020, Patrick Mahomes was going in the 3rd round of startup drafts. And I'm like, this is insane. We know who he is. He's an MVP quarterback. We don't need to see more to know, like, this is going to be one of the best and most productive quarterbacks in the league over the next decade. And so what happens is you can draft Patrick Mahomes in the 3rd round of a Dynasty startup, or you could trade equivalent value, equivalent lowercase value. Let's like whatever the value is of a 3rd round startup pick, you can trade that much to acquire Mahomes. You can start him for 5 years and get 5 years worth of high-end quarterback production. And at the end of the 5 years, his value, lowercase v value, is going to be around a 3rd round pick in startup drafts. So you can buy him for N value, start him for 5 years, get all that production, and then sell him at the end of that for N value. And basically all of that production that you just got was free. And there's a lot of players for that. Like basically anytime we've seen enough, like we know who a player is, and the more confident we are in who a player is, the more it creates these little inefficient bubbles where you can basically get free production because their value is not declining after big games like in a perfect platonic ideal world it should. Instead, it's holding flat. And that discrepancy where it's supposed to be declining but it's not, that creates an inefficiency that you can exploit for free production.
Oh, it makes total sense. I mean, and that's why, I mean, you look at guys like a Justin Jefferson or like you mentioned, possibly Brock Bowers, that we're getting pretty close to putting him in that territory. Or there was a time that you could look at certain running backs and probably even have that. Adrian Peterson was probably a guy like that at one point in his career, at least before he started to becoming the well-traveled Adrian Peterson.
Right.
Yeah, you know, so tight ends, elite tight ends tend to hold that value very well. So, no, I mean, that's great.
And I think the other crucial thing is it's not necessarily just the superstars because like obviously Justin Jefferson, but Dak Prescott is the guy I always give an example of where like Dak Prescott's value hasn't changed in years. And he's not, sometimes he is like that number 1, number 2, number 3 fantasy quarterback. But for the most part, he's just like a really good, productive quarterback. He's not like an MVP for the most part. You know, he's good enough that he can kind of flirt in that range and he'll have his ups and downs. But by and large, we know that Dak Prescott is a very good quarterback who's going to be starting for years more and producing for years more. He might have like an 8th, 9th, 10th round startup price now. You can probably get another few years of production out of him, and he'll still have that 8th, 9th, 10th round startup price at the end of that. That's still free production. It doesn't have to be superstars. It's mostly just players where we're not really getting new information about who they are anymore. We know who they are.
Yeah, Stafford was that way for a little bit. Sans injuries. Herbert might end up being that kind of guy if he doesn't make it all the way into elite territory. You know, CJ Stroud looks like someone that if they can amp up a little bit of what's going on around him, that he could turn into a Dak Prescott type of guy. You know, we'll see in a few years whether that happens with him. But yeah, no, that's fascinating. So we've got the 2026 Hall of Fame selection committee in process here. They've got 52 modern era players. I thought it would be fun for us to maybe go position by position and talk about who the nominees are, who's new, who was a finalist, and just kind of like from that each position, maybe we say, is there anybody here that we feel like we would vote for to be in it, to be a finalist at least, and then we can kind of narrow it down from there as we get, because we may have somebody from each each position, and go, okay, well we can only have 15, so let's see what we've got. So starting off, we've got quarterbacks. 2 new ones are, ironically, to me, it's Drew Brees and Phillip Rivers, since they're forever tied, you know, with AJ Smith in the Hall of Shame. But those two, and then
the Lord of No Rings, as his nickname was.
The Lord of No Rings, exactly. And that's great. And then Eli Manning, who was a finalist last year. Any of those 3 jump out to you that you would say, yeah, I would want one to be a finalist right now?
I mean, obviously, Breeze is a slam dunk first ballot. There's no real discussion needs to be had there.
Yeah.
I feel very strongly that Eli Manning should not be in the Hall of Fame. And this is controversial, yes, because he's got the 2 rings. But outside of those 2 Super Bowl runs, what did he ever do? You know, he was never like in statistic communities, there's terms called black ink and gray ink. And it's from sites like Pro Football Reference, where if you lead the league in a stat, they bold your production in like bolded black ink. And if you're in like the top 10, often they'll do like italics. And so that's like black ink is how many times you led the league in something meaningful. Gray ink would be how many times you were in like the top 10 in something meaningful. And Eli Manning's black ink and gray ink is just shockingly low. Not just compared to Hall of Famers, but compared to guys who have no shot at reaching the Hall of Fame. He was never really one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the NFL. He did have a great productive season in 2011, the same year where like all of the top quarterbacks also had great productive seasons. But for the most part, he was kind of just a guy who's like a bit above average for a really, really long time. And that has a lot of value to a franchise. If you were the New York Giants, you loved everything you got out of Eli Manning, and you shouldn't have to apologize for Eli Manning's career. He absolutely shouldn't apologize for his career. But the Hall of Fame is not a franchise honor, it's a league honor. And I feel strongly that the league should recognize the best in the league. And Eli Manning just wasn't that. He's better than a lot of the analytics crowd would have you believe. But he just wasn't consistently a top 5, top 6 quarterback. He was a very good quarterback for a very long time who happened to win 2 Super Bowls, just like Jim Plunkett, who's also not in the Hall of Fame. It'd be like if Joe Flacco had a miracle Super Bowl run with the Bengals this year. Would we be talking about him as a Hall of Famer? Because he also would have had comparable playoff success to Eli Manning. And to me, that's just not enough. Eli Manning should not be a Hall of Famer. This will be very hotly debated for years to come. I suspect he probably will make it at some point because the Hall gives great deference to quarterbacks, and especially to champion quarterbacks. Right. Well, yes, and Manning's. But to me, I feel very strongly. I would much rather see Phillip Rivers in the Hall of Fame because Rivers absolutely was, in my mind, a top 5 quarterback for a number of years. I think he was a better quarterback than Manning. And in my mind, I would put Rivers in. Although I'm not really losing sleep if Rivers doesn't go in either, because there's a lot of quarterbacks in the Hall of Fame. To me, he's kind of on that edge. Breeze is an easy in, Manning is an easy out. Rivers is one of those guys where I'm not really losing sleep either way.
Yeah, I would say that, we get into quarterback wins a lot of times when we start talking about players like Eli Manning, players who don't separate themselves statistically, but maybe they were on good teams, and then people start wanting to make the argument about whether he adds value to a team winning. But to me, it's kind of like Drew Brees with the New York Giants. You don't think he would add more value to that? And that kind of destroys the argument for me.
Or Rivers. I mean,
Rivers,
put Eli on the Chargers. Does he win 2 Super Bowls? Probably not.
No.
I mean, they're the Chargers still.
Yeah.
And the Chargers are cursed.
But keep Drew Brees there.
Sure.
And maybe you get a Super Bowl.
Yeah.
I think that, and I think Drew Brees elevated his team. I would absolutely agree on both counts. Eli Manning had Hall of Fame moments in big games, but he didn't have a Hall of Fame career. And I think that there's needs to be separation about that. If you want to put the David Tyree catch with Eli Manning throwing it in the Hall of Fame, and you want to celebrate that as one of the great moments in the biggest stages of the game, and how Manning did that, fantastic. Do you want to put Eli Manning in the Hall of Fame for his entire career with the competition he has? I'm with you. I think Drew Brees elevated his team on a consistent basis much more. The stats are absolutely there, and just from a film watching standpoint, the accuracy, the pocket skill were a tier above Manning. Rivers had some of that. I could definitely see how Rivers, he carried some bad teams at the end a little bit, at least made them competitive each week. But I'd still put him below Breeze. Breeze would be it for me, and I agree he's a first year guy.
Would you put Rivers in the Hall of Fame?
No. It would be close, but no. I just don't.
Phillip Rivers or Ken Anderson? If you were going to put one in and leave one out.
Ooh. I'd have to look at Ken Anderson's stats again and look at his game a little bit more before I would go there. But
I would suggest on Anderson, don't look at the stats, look at the film.
Yeah.
Because I feel like Anderson is one of those where the stats, because he really was he was playing in that Bill Walsh offense. He really was like a decade ahead of his time. And Walsh said one time, he's like, it's actually easy to manipulate a quarterback stats. I used to do that with Anderson.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons he's so controversial, because the analytics crowd who are just looking at the stats, they're like, well, why is he not in? This is crazy. He's one of the best quarterbacks of all time.
Yeah.
And, like the old school guys who are, well, no, like he was good. He was a great quarterback. There's really no questioning that. But he was not on a level that his stats would suggest.
If I had to choose one, I mean, I would probably pick Rivers, but I'd make the joke that I'd take the 2 Eli Manning moments and put them in Steve McNair's career, and then we'd have a Hall of Famer. But that's a different story. Or we'd give him Randy Moss.
Hang on, this is kind of fun. I'm going to throw some more quarterbacks at you, and right. Let's say Randall Cunningham.
No.
Would you put him? Let's compare to Rivers. Above or below Rivers? Randall Cunningham.
Below.
Okay. Donovan McNabb.
Below.
Okay. Tony Romo.
Below.
Okay. So it does seem like Rivers is kind of like right at that.
Yeah.
How about Kurt Warner? I know Warner's already in, but if you could put in one, if you had a Magic Hall of Fame wand and one of those guys was in and one of those guys was out.
I would say Rivers, because I think he did more with less.
Okay.
Kurt Warner at the height of his career had amazing production, but I'd still wonder what would have happened if Trent Green were in there.
Yeah.
And he had, Warner had some dips that were really awful. And then a kind of resurgence, but that resurgence was with, come on, Larry Fitzgerald and Anquan Bolden.
Right.
Please.
Yeah.
I would say he's really good, really, really good, but I would probably give Rivers a little bit more. Yeah.
I'm not positive that Kurt Warner was a better quarterback than Carson Palmer, who we saw a similar thing. Started out great, had the dips, went to Oakland, and his Oakland tenure is kind of underrated by people who are just looking back on it, because that team was awful.
Yeah.
And we're like, what? They're going to trade for Carson Palmer, who's been struggling recently, and suddenly they're competitive. And then they traded for Carson Palmer, and suddenly they were competitive. It was like overnight, completely different team. It's kind of like Joe Flacco to the Bengals, where like he just instantly made them a threat in a way that they weren't before. But yeah, then he went to Arizona, and his Arizona production, I would argue, was better than Warner's with Bolden and Fitzgerald. But obviously, I mean, Warner's case is at one point he had the 3 highest passing yardage totals in Super Bowl history. His 3 Super Bowls were the 3 highest passing yardage totals.
Yeah.
So he kind of had that Eli Manning thing going for him as well.
I just don't know many quarterbacks who actually had a Hall of Fame running back, first ballot Hall of Fame running back, at least worthy of that, who was like Christian McCaffrey's basically play father. And then you have Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt. I mean, that's almost on the level of Montana, but we know that watching Montana over the span of years, with and without some of those collection of players, to me, watching all you have to see, I mean, it's simplistic. You have to just see Montana with the Chiefs and with that collection of talent compared to what he had in San Francisco, and you could, and an aging one at that, and how good he still was to elevate that team. That says a lot to me. I don't know. I would probably choose. I'd be with you on Palmer. Palmer was a fantastic quarterback.
And it's funny too, because for a while Palmer was kind of the guy I comped to Eli Manning as like that replacement level, because he started so strong in Cincinnati, and then he just like plateaued and flatlined. And I'm like, he's like that. He's the Andy Dalton line, the Eli Manning line, the Carson Palmer line, where he's like good enough that you're not actively looking for a replacement, but he's not so good that I feel like he's elevating the team.
Yeah.
And then he went and like made me look completely foolish because he started absolutely elevating teams again. So other than McNair, do you have any really spicy quarterback takes about guys who like maybe other people wouldn't be into, but who maybe should be getting some love?
Oh, I'd have to think about that a little bit more, and I haven't really considered anybody else other than McNair at this point. Because do you?
No, in terms of guys who people think shouldn't be in and who I think should, no, there's probably not that much off the beaten path. There are some guys who I think are wildly underrated. Donovan McNabb, I think if you look at like who he was playing with, and it's hard because he kind of played an ugly game. Like his incompletions were ugly. Like it didn't
He's
look like a great
way
game.
better than the media, the way they treated
Absolutely,
him, for
absolutely.
sure.
He was definitely, like it was an effective game, in a way that people just don't really understand. He's throwing to Todd Pinkston and James Thrash, and the 20 games where he had like a legitimate receiver in Terrell Owens, he was putting up like Peyton Manning numbers passing, like as a passer. But then when it was Pinkston and Thrash, he was putting up like Michael Vick production as a runner, and it was a very adaptable game. And people talk about how horrible he was in Washington and Minnesota, and you look at it and it's like he was like a 34-year-old beat up end of the line quarterback in a new system, and his production was like a hair below league average. I don't really know why the image of McNabb is so much lower than the reality of McNabb. All that said, I wouldn't put him in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
I maybe Randall Cunningham would be my spiciest, my guy who, like, I low key kind of think I would put Randall Cunningham in the Hall of Fame before Kurt Warner. I feel like he had a similar number of like MVP caliber seasons, but he was doing it with nothing. Like,
Yeah.
receivers, other than obviously Minnesota, he was stacked. But like, look at what he did in Minnesota. But like, and his head coach was Buddy Ryan, who, like, I can't think of a bigger handicap for a quarterback to play with than like having Buddy Ryan, who actively hated all quarterbacks, including his own, out there just like throwing you to the wolves. I don't know. I've got a lot of respect for what Cunningham did. And I also think that he was feared around the league, in a similar way to like young Michael Vick was, in a way that I think people have kind of forgotten, like how much teams did not want to face Randall Cunningham.
Yeah, I would say that Randall Cunningham had stretches. He had stretches of Hall of Fame caliber play, and is close. But I'm still not quite there over the long term. McNabb, I would probably put in ahead of Cunningham, and I do think he kind of got a raw deal with the whole TO thing, and then the throwing up in the Super Bowl, and then just
which he never threw up. Like, there's video. I don't know where that. I mean, because I remember too. I'm like, oh yeah, McNabb threw up, and then somebody's like, no, he actually didn't throw up, and like, it's weird. Why does everybody remember?
And why does anybody care?
Why does anybody care?
But that there's all of that kind of stuff, and then I think too, it's funny because I look at McNabb and I go, well, Jackson Dart looks a little bit like McNabb and some of the ugliness of his game, and he's like, it looks beautiful, Meanwhile, Caleb Williams, I think, does some beautiful work, and they're treating him like I would think some people should be treating Jackson Dart. I mean, I love Matt Patanti, but him talking about him as an upscale Zach Wilson, I'm just like, get back to the offensive line, my man. I got to tell him that next time I talk to him. But I mean,
he
Matt's
hates Williams
great.
because Williams makes his line look bad.
Yeah,
he's biased.
That's probably what it is.
His favorite quarterback is whoever makes the line look good. He would have loved Doug Williams, man.
Yep. See, there you go, for sure.
I guess that would be another really spicy take. Is everybody talks about the Hall of Fame as it's about the play on the field, and that is a very large, maybe absolutely the dominant component of it. I'm arguing against Eli Manning because the play on the field wasn't there, but I also low key kind of think, there's too many quarterbacks in the Hall of Fame. I don't really think there's anybody who's not in who should be in. I think there are probably a few guys who are in who shouldn't be, but based on the standards that are established, I think Doug Williams merits serious consideration, because in terms of quality of play, I think he was about as good as Eli Manning. In terms of volume of play, like, he didn't play as many games because it was the 80s. He was like the only black quarterback drafted in the first round. He was like the 40th highest paid quarterback in a 28-team league, and he asked for a raise. And then he was like blackballed from the NFL. He had to go to the USFL. And so in terms of quality of play, I think it was good. The volume wasn't there. But in terms of like impact on the league, How many kids grow up today wanting to be the next Eli Manning? Unless they live in New York, probably not that many. How many young black up and coming quarterbacks in the 80s and 90s and 2000s grew up wanting to be the next Doug Williams? All of them. Who was the Heisman winning, the black quarterback in the 90s?
Charlie Ward.
Yeah, he talked about like all of the quarterbacks who talk about like when did they believe that they could play in the NFL? And it was Doug Williams' Super Bowl. Like that's when they looked at it and they said, that could be me. I could do that. And then also his work off the field. He's worked with a bunch of other black quarterbacks through history. They've created an organization called the Field Generals. They hold camps for young black quarterbacks, skills camps, and help and support them in their goals of reaching the league. Cam Newton came up through the camps. So just in terms of like impact on the league off the field, which is something that doesn't really get considered, but I think should absolutely be part of the consideration process. I think Doug Williams probably merits discussion.
That's a fun argument. So let's move on to running backs then. We got...
I know this is your favorite.
I don't know. There's a few, but Warwick Dunn, Eddie George, Frank Gore's new, Marshawn Lynch, LaShawn McCoy, Lorenzo Neal, Fred Taylor, who was a finalist last year, and Ricky Waters. I'll tell you who stands out to me. I mean, to me, McCoy being new, McCoy probably is the one that playing on multiple teams, playing at an older age, playing at a high level on multiple teams, I feel pretty good about. Lynch is obviously a huge favorite for me. And when you include what he did in those playoff games and the production that he had, if I'm going to talk about big plays that might matter and kind of go against my whole Eli Manning argument a little bit, I would probably say Lynch is one that I would say more qualifies, just because I would say what Lynch did on those plays was more impressive, more difficult than what Eli Manning did on those plays.
And more attributable to Lynch himself. Because, I mean, remember, for like the David Tyree catch, it's not the Eli Manning throw. It's the David Tyree catch. The Mario Manningham catch. It's not the Eli Manning throw. It's the Mario Manningham catch. Like, he put the ball where they could get it. Yeah. And he, especially, like, he was under pressure. He was under duress. It was a good throw. But it was a better catch than it was a throw on both of those plays.
Yeah. So, to me, Marshawn Lynch is one of those players that I think you look at the totality of his game, and while maybe stats-wise it isn't as high as maybe some other guys who are compilers, I think that the production's pretty meaningful. Fred Taylor is fascinating because he's always the guy that you're going to look at and go, that those early career stats and the early career play was fantastic, and then when he started to stay healthy, it was good, but it wasn't like fantastic. And you're not just like, and I would say that like him and like Eddie George is not as nearly as flashy as Fred Taylor or as LaShawn McCoy. And he was definitely a compiler, but he was a compiler in an era where the era was kind of like, we're going to wear you down. And there should maybe be some credit to a running back who, yes, you could, people now will go, oh, well, Derrick Henry, all he does is fall forward and he gets 4 yards. And they could probably have said the same thing about Eddie George to some degree. But I think that in an era that was more physical and it was a tougher era, to have played as long as he did and to have like those 4 or 5 years of like 1,100 to 1,400 yards,
like 400 carries a year, crazy carry.
Yes. Yeah. There's something to be said about that, especially on an offense where the design is like, we have one of the best defenses in the league. I mean, like statistically, they would have gone, if they beat the Ravens to get to the Super Bowl one of those years, though you could say Eddie George was the reason why they didn't on one of those, but I would say that's a little much. But if they had beaten them, their defense would have been statistically, I think the year that the Ravens defense with Trent Dilfer was a big deal. Statistically, that Titans defense was better, I
It
think.
was.
Yeah. So they were a run first play defense, take care of the football team, and he was that guy. And he wore teams down. And while those numbers weren't great, if you watched him at the end of games, he was absolutely dynamic because of he still had that stamina to play at a high level, kind of the way Marshawn Lynch does, that whole play stamina. They both had that. And then he had a debilitating toe injury that he wasn't quite the same after the toe surgery, and he had those inserts and he was trying to figure it out. And then there's Gore. I mean, Gore, to me, I've been told so many times that he's teaching tape for running backs. And he was great, but I think of this group, I would probably rank it Lynch, Taylor, George. No, I don't know. It's tough, man, because I think George, McCoy, and Lynch and Taylor are probably all in the same tier for me. Lynch is slightly higher. I'd probably put Waters and Warwick Dunn a little bit lower than that. And then I'd say the guy that I think might need to go in is Lorenzo Neal. Just because I think while it's statistically not great, what he did, he was a long-time blocker for LaDainian Tomlinson, wasn't he? Wasn't not a short-term thing. In an offense where they really leaned on that, I thought he was a great fullback, and I would probably say if there's a guy that I would put into that who stands out, it would be Lorenzo Neal.
Yeah, he also blocked for Corey Dillon, blocked for Eddie George for a while. I don't think that you have to put a player in just because he was the best at what he did. That's the Steve Tasker argument where he's the best gunner in history, which first of all, anytime anybody says that, oh, he was the best gunner in history. Okay, what's the rest of your top 10 look like?
Right.
Because if you don't have a top 10, same thing with Hines Ward. He's the best blocking receiver in history. Great. Who's the rest of your top 10?
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't have a top 10, this is not something you've considered. You're just throwing stuff out because you like the guy and you want to get him in.
Sure.
So I don't think fullback's a less valuable position. I don't think that the best fullback of modern history has to go in, but I think that he added plenty of value.
Yeah. I mean, just to interject real quick, I mean, you could contrast him with guys who were more productive on statistically as fullbacks, like Larry Centers, or you could look at a Mark Van Egan, or you could look at William Floyd, Allstott for sure, But I think that there are some players that what they did at such a high level, and they were in such high demand for players who will deserve Hall of Fame consideration. He's a big part of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think he added more value on the field. Obviously, compared to Steve Tasker, no question, way more value on the field than a Tasker, or even a Ray Guy. I think that fullback added more value than a punter. So if we're putting in the best punter, we should probably put in the best fullback. He did it on a lot of different teams. Honestly, I think the case for him is similar to another guy who I sometimes make a case for, Ted Washington, where he did one thing. Yeah. He was a massive mountain of a man who stood in the middle of the line and basically said, "You're not running up the middle. Not as long as I'm on the field," which granted was only 40% of snaps because he was so huge. The conditioning wasn't necessarily there. On pass rush situations, he's not really helping you out that much. He did one thing. He was one of the best run blocking nose tackles of all time. And he did it for a ton of different teams. Everywhere he went, he made an immediate impact. Everywhere, as soon as he left, his absence was immediately visible. And it's not the most valuable thing. It's a passing league, plugging up the middle of the line against runs, but it's still valuable. It's not nothing. And to me, I think Lorenzo Neal and Ted Washington have very similar cases where they were just extraordinarily good at this thing that 40 years ago was the thing. If you do this, you are dominating the league, and it had been getting phased out and falling out of favor. And they were one of the last true dominant players in that mold. I don't have a problem with Neal going in. I also don't have a problem with him not going in. In terms of like total value added, I think he ranks last on that list of running backs.
Sure.
Just because run blocking is less valuable than running. But I don't mind him going in at all. As for the rest of it, I see the running back list and I'm like, what are we doing here? I think it just shows there's too many running backs in the Hall of Fame. The Hall has been too deferential to the position. And I like some of these guys. I like Waters just because he did it in so many different places, which is a big thing to me. I love Lynch. I'm not going to get too mad if Lynch goes in. McCoy was great. I don't think he belongs in. Frank Gore, in terms of like getting the most out of what was available to him, first ballot Hall of Famer. But in terms of, again, impact on the game.
Frank Gore is a Hall of Fame story.
Yeah.
He is not a Hall of Fame player. And though he is, if I was going to say skill sets, making the most out of his skills and what he probably does contribute to running backs that don't even know it by how they get coached, yes, you could maybe even make the Doug Williams argument in a low-level way, but it wouldn't be as public and it wouldn't therefore be as impactful. But he's that guy that like he's like the musician that was influential to a bunch of musicians you love who were great, but didn't sell records and didn't have a lot of hit songs, didn't sell a ton of records, and wasn't seen as an innovator, in what they did. But they were a master craftsman. But they just, it's just one of those things. And I think of him as a guy like Kenny Durham. None of you probably know who Kenny Durham is. He's a trumpeter, who most trumpet players would say he was an absolutely great trumpet player, and influenced how he was a great writer, and he was also a great improviser. But there are a lot more exciting trumpet players out there who improvise, like Dizzy Gillespie, or as an example, or Freddie Hubbard, or folks like that anybody who listens to jazz would probably know. But Kenny Durham is probably more of like a jazz musician's jazz musician. And I think Frank Gore is probably the top of the heap of a running back's running back, but not a Hall of Famer. Sad to say.
I think like the Frank Gore career is kind of summed up by this. He retired with almost 20,000 yards from scrimmage. He ranks 4th all time in yards from scrimmage. He only had 3 seasons where he was in the top 10 in yards from scrimmage. Compared to Ricky Waters ranks 27th in career yards from scrimmage. He had 8 seasons where he was in the top 10 in yards from scrimmage, including a first place overall finish in 1996. So, he had a truly remarkable string of like 1,200 yard seasons. But to me, like if you're going to get in based on value, if I were to like posit a simple formula, it would be like, how much value did you add over the average player times how many games you played, adding that value. So you can get in by adding a huge margin of value over average for a short time. Someone like Terrell Davis. You can get in by adding, a smaller amount of value over average over a much longer time. Somebody like Curtis Martin. But I feel like Frank Gore, for the most part, just wasn't adding any value over the average player. He kind of was the average running back. And again, given the story, given all the injuries he went through, given how old he was, it's remarkable that he was able to be somewhere approaching an average running back for as long as he was, but he's just not accumulating the value necessary to get.
Frank Gore provided average to above average numbers at it for a long period, and did it at a high level of difficulty. But the problem is yes, while it's impressive that you can make smarter choices and more daring decisions with great craft over Kenyon Drake and Marlon Mack in Indianapolis when you should have been retired for 4 years, it doesn't make you a great back. Like it's hard for me to say. I think he was a great back, but I don't think he was a Hall of Fame back. And I don't know how to differentiate those two just from
And
what
I'll
I've
also
seen.
say, since we're talking about Waters, it must be mentioned that Gore did this with a very high degree of professionalism. I don't think any team ever regretted employing Frank Gore.
No.
I think several teams regretted employing Ricky Waters despite the production. And from a franchise's perspective, like for something like a Ring of Honor, I think that professionalism matters more to me than for a league-wide honor like the Hall of Fame. Like Terrell Owens, from Philadelphia's perspective, Terrell Owens' tenure there was very mixed. He added a lot of production and value, and he also burned a lot of bridges and arguably made the team worse when he forced his way out. But from the NFL standpoint, to me, that was unambiguously a huge asset to his Hall of Fame credentials. Yeah. The thing that when I look at the running backs, the thing that strikes me, and it just reinforces how I don't think any of these guys should get in. It's not the names that are there, but the names who fell off. Like you look at the guys who are there, guys who made it to the semifinals last year and didn't this year. Priest Holmes, Tiki Barber. I think their case is just as good as any of these guys, if not better.
I would say this. The only argument I'll make about Gore, because I want to continue this is what you just mentioned, is just that I do believe skill-wise, if Frank Gore were in Ricky Waters' shoes, like he would have been better than Ricky Waters.
Probably.
I think that he would have been better because Frank Gore he seemed to be on teams that never were good, and he was kind of that guy who was so good on teams that never were. And that's why he's not going to get in, but I have such ambivalence about it because I know just how good he was on film. Like on film, he's a Hall of Famer to me. But in the total spectrum of things, he doesn't get there.
Yeah, the worse his teams were, the more productive he was. Like when he was on those awful, awful, awful San Francisco teams, those were his best years in terms of statistics, which is partly an indictment. There's a lot of guys who we've seen be super productive because there's just nobody else to absorb. Like he's the only good player on the team. They're just going to go to him as much as possible. I agree that he never really had, like put him on the greatest show on turf Rams. I think the Rams are fine. Like you can't ever replace a guy like Marshall Faulk, but I think Frank Gore would have been up to the challenge. Yeah,
or put him in Kansas City behind those great offensive lines that Priest Holmes was running behind. As good as Priest Holmes was, So it's just tough.
Steven Jackson's another guy who I think of a lot with Frank Gore, where like I feel like Frank Gore is Steven Jackson with longevity. Just in terms of like quality of play and like the terribleness of the teams that they were on, and kind of how unheralded their production was because it was on dead end teams going nowhere. I don't think we'll ever see Steven Jackson on one of these semifinalist lists, but to me, he's not got a better or worse case than Fred Taylor, Frank Gore, some of the guys we do see, which again, I think it just reinforces the arbitrariness of who's advancing and who's not, which to me just reinforces that like we've got enough running backs in the Hall of Fame. We've kind of mined that mine dry. It's time to like induct people from other positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's happened is because it was such a running dominant league for so long, and it's only been in the past 25 years that it's gone away from that to some degree. So you're still going to have some guys left over from that era, the end of that era to the beginning of the next era, as part of that. But also, I mean, I guess for me, like you said, you wouldn't mind Lynch. I wouldn't mind McCoy.
I liked McCoy. Yeah, McCoy was fun. And I'm a sucker for running backs with receiving chops. Yeah. So I was, and he was a pleasure to watch play.
Yeah,
just a beautiful runner.
He was, and I think that's part of what happens is that's why Fred Taylor made it so close, because he was
pretty runner.
Yeah, he came close to what Barry Sanders could do in a bigger body with more power. Like as an athlete, he was a Hall of Fame athlete who became a Hall of Fame, who became a very, very good runner, who, but you just, I don't know. That's a tough one too. So I'm with you. I understand where you're coming from with the positions. Let's go to receivers and we'll close it out with that, and then
All right.
we'll do some more positions
You
in
know
the
what
next
happens when
week.
you start talking Hall of Fame with me? I got thoughts, man.
No, it's cool. We both do. Um, all right, so we've got Anquan Bolden, who's been nominated before, who's sitting there. Larry Fitzgerald is new. Torrey Holt was a finalist. Jimmy Smith, Steve Smith was a finalist, and this Steve Smith Senior, not Steve Smith too, and Hines Ward and Reggie Wayne was a finalist last year. So, where are you on receivers? Anybody there you would want?
Yeah, Fitzgerald is deservedly going to be a first ballot choice. There's not really any debate on that. I really like him. I think he's a little bit overrated. Um, he there's a lot of like the Frank Gore compiling type
Yeah.
production, especially towards the end there. But the difference for me is the peak was there as well. You look from 2005 to 2009, 2011. He was, like a legitimate top three dominant threat. Anytime he had reasonable quarterback play, and we were talking about Kurt Warner and Carson Palmer, and how like it's easier to look good when you've got Anquan Bolden and Larry Fitzgerald to throw to. And I know we both are big fans of Anquan Bolden, but the reality is when they were both there together, Larry Fitzgerald was the number one. And defenses covered him as if he was the number one. They gave more attention to Larry Fitzgerald. Quarterbacks looked at him as if he was the number one. And so anytime you're up against another Hall of Fame caliber player in Anquan Bolden and you're managing to outshine him, that is tremendously to your credit. Yeah, I think a lot of the all-time records, that's just a fluke of longevity. Some players' careers end early, some players last forever. And I don't know that that's necessarily a reflection of how good the players are. Some flames burn bright and burn out. Some flames stick around. But I don't think there's going to be any debate. Fitzgerald is and should be a first ballot Hall of Famer. The rest of them, I think, have very interesting cases. I would not put Hines Ward in, although I think he's overrated in some corners and underrated in other corners. I don't know if he was the best blocking receiver of all time. I don't have a top 10, so I'm not really qualified to say. I do think if he was, it's probably not as big of a difference as the saying would have it seem. But also, like, who are the other really good blocking receivers that I know of? Like Muhsin Muhammad was great, Keyshawn Johnson was great, and like they just don't get the same. Like it's not cited to their credit nearly as much. Like even like Puka Nacua throws some great blocks, but who talks about blocking with Puka Nacua? I feel like you only talk about blocking when the other stuff isn't there. And Ward played on some low volume passing teams. He was a larger percentage of his offense than some of the other guys on this list, but I just don't think he was dominant enough. I don't think he was feared enough by defenses. I don't think he could, like single-handedly carry a team like we saw Steve Smith do multiple times through his career. So Ward for me would be a no. I wouldn't be super mad if he did, but to me, he's a very firm no. Holt and Bolden, I really like them both. I feel like we kind of got too many receivers and we got a lot more tough decisions coming up. And so those ones would regretfully be no for me, just as a numbers game. Same with Reggie Wayne. I would have Holt and Bolden above Wayne, actually. I know, again, he's got the career numbers. I feel like he's kind of like Larry Fitzgerald without that like monster dangerous peak. So yeah, that'd be a no on Holt, Bolden, and Wayne. The two Smiths are really interesting cases. Steve Smith, he should have been first ballot.
Yeah, that was a crime.
In terms of career production, he's got the career longevity and production. He's up there with the all times. I'm actually going to look up while I'm talking. He's on the all time leaderboards because he lasted for forever. So if you like long careers and high standings, he's up there.
He arguably had the best season ever as a wide receiver.
Yes. Yeah. There have been two receivers since the merger who have led the league in receiving yardage on a team that was bottom 5 in pass attempts. And it was Isaac Bruce, not in his huge year in 1995, but in the next year in 1996. But his total was relatively low. It was kind of a down year for receivers. And then Steve Smith in 2005 averaged like 100 yards a game back when receivers rarely averaged 100 yards a game on a team that was starting Jake Delhomme and bottom 5 in pass attempts. And as good as that season was, 2008 might have been better. And it doesn't really get its due because he missed 2 games. But so the total numbers are not quite as big, but he had multiple seasons where he was just single-handedly carrying. And then another point in Fitzgerald's favor that I didn't mention is he was one of the best playoff receivers of all time. So was Steve Smith. I think if you look at it, the top 3 playoff receivers of all time were probably Jerry Rice, Larry Fitzgerald, and Steve Smith. And I said he carried teams. Oh yeah, I looked it up. So he finished 8th in career receiving yards. So the total volume was there. The peak was there. He carried teams. That 2005 playoff run, they played, I believe it was the Bears first, who were one of the top defenses in the NFL that year. And they were, like a pick from a lot of teams to make the Super Bowl just on the strength of their defense. And he just absolutely destroyed them. 12 receptions, 218 yards, 2 touchdowns. Looking up, I don't think anybody else in that game. So second most receiving yards in that game, Bernard Berry, for Chicago, Drew Carter with 2 catches for 43 yards. So it was just the Steve Smith Sr. show. Just carrying the team against a phenomenal defense. And then the next year, or the next game, Seattle's like, our game plan is we're not going to let Steve Smith beat us because everybody else on the Panthers was hurt. They were down like 3 running backs that year by that point. And so the Seahawks are like, we're not just going to double him. I saw legit triple coverages of Steve Smith because the Seahawks are like, we're going to throw everything at Steve Smith, hold him in check, and we're going to make somebody else beat us. Steve Smith had 11 targets, 5 receptions, 33 yards. They largely did manage to hold him in check, but he also took a punt return 59 yards for a touchdown. And so he still managed to impact the game. And that's another thing that people don't really talk about with Steve Smith is he was one of the best returners in the league for a long time. And a lot of the skills translated. And so, yeah, he had this amazing, amazing peak. He had incredible longevity. Like I said, ranked 8th career in receiving, 9th career in yards from scrimmage. Then he also added this wild card return value. Where's his rank? I think he's like top 5 all time in all-purpose yards. No, he's 9th in all-purpose yards. But he just had so many things going for him. Defenders would consistently say, like, they hated covering Steve Smith. Like, the NFL players gave him all the respect and recognition he was due. He played with bad quarterbacks. Jake Delhomme was at his best average. Like, he aspired to be Eli Manning, and then the wheels completely fell off. He helped Cam Newton have the best season of his career as a rookie, where like everybody's like, oh, Steve Smith has passed his prime, but he helped carry that offense. He went to Baltimore and immediately made an impact on a new team there and was the top receiver there. Steve Smith, to me, just checks every single box. He should have been a first ballot Hall of Famer. I think his career was every bit as good as Larry Fitzgerald's, and he just doesn't get that recognition.
No, and on top of all that, he comes back from an Achilles tear at age 37 and still puts up 1 yard shy of 800 and 5 touchdowns. And, just you talk about the ability of this player. One of the best matchups I ever saw was the first year in Baltimore when he and A.J. Green were facing off, essentially, and just watching these 2 run routes. Steve Smith played literally feet taller than what he was, but still had that quick twitch route running ability, played with unbelievable strength and leverage. He was physical, and like you said, Hines Ward, where I would say Hines Ward was underrated in many respects is that he was a good special teamer. He could be a return specialist and give you yardage and big plays. He could block punts. He could be a tackler. He was a football player. He was an excellent football player. And I remember him at Georgia when he came there as a running back out of Forest Park, and then wound up playing quarterback and wide receiver for that team. In his senior year, he played quarterback with a broken jaw, with his jaw wired shut, and was keeping them competitive in the bowl games. He was that kind of player, and so on a team, he's absolutely in that team's Hall of Fame, their Ring of Honor, whatever. He was a great team player. Is he a player that you'd want maybe on a team to defend the planet because he's, as I joked, he's that smiling hand grenade that you're going to throw into a crowd, and there's a certain element of how that's going to maybe help a team, and you've got that kind of dirty work player attitude who can run decent routes in the scheme of what you ask him to do. Sure. But Steve Smith is like basically taking Hines Ward and adding Isaac Bruce and Calvin Johnson to it and mixing it into one player. He was a phenomenal route runner, phenomenal go up and get it player, phenomenal runner after the catch, return specialist, blocker, intimidator. Very few players are intimidating at the wide receiver position. They may be scary to an extent because of their speed. Jerry Rice was intimidating. Every route looked the same. You didn't know what you were going to get. Calvin Johnson was intimidating. Randy Moss was intimidating. But I think Steve Smith belonged in that category as well. And you didn't want to talk trash to him because he was one of those players that if you did and got him going, it was pretty much over, for you at that point.
You're talking about Hines Ward is such a great asset to the team, and it's worth noting that Steve Smith had his drawbacks too.
Yeah.
He broke a teammate's orbital socket because they got heated in camp, and he cold cocked him and basically ended that teammate's career. He was very volatile to play against, but he was also very volatile to play with. And from an individual team standpoint, obviously the positives outweighed the negatives, but the negatives.
It's like Charles Haley on as a defensive end,
right.
Same thing. But Jimmy Smith, let's talk about him because Jimmy Smith to me definitely, I think he deserves to be in, and I think that his longevity, his ability to win as a route runner, to win as a contested catch guy, big play speed guy, but more than that. And I know that he had a fantastic route runner opposite him in the Mark Brunell era with Keenan McCardell. But I think the consistently strong level of play is up there with guys like Fitzgerald. Maybe not in the playoffs, but as a player, big, strong, fast, good route runner, excellent hands, longevity. It's all there for me.
Yeah, I suspect that the ship has probably sailed on Jimmy Smith just because how many good receivers are going to be coming down the pike. I think his opportunity to get in might have passed, and I think that's a shame.
Yeah.
Because he was wildly underrated. I get the fascination with Fred Taylor. Fred Taylor had one career Pro Bowl. He was not the Jacksonville Jaguars skill player who dominated the most here. If the Jacksonville contingent was throwing the same kind of weight behind Jimmy Smith rather than Fred Taylor, and he was getting that kind of momentum, I think he could have made some noise. The crazy thing about Jimmy Smith, to me, about his career, he had 288 career receiving yards by his 27th birthday. He you talk about late bloomers.
Yeah.
He's drafted by Dallas. He's in the second round. He's on the practice squad. He had a lot of personal off the field issues. And basically people consider him done. He's a complete afterthought. People think he's a total bust. Jacksonville takes him in the expansion draft. And in 1995, their first year, he has 22 catches, 288 yards, 3 touchdowns. Those are the first 288 yards of Jimmy Smith's career as an NFL player. And then he played 10 more years and topped 1,000 yards in 9 of them, would have done it in all 10, except he got hurt and missed 4 games at age 34 in one of those years. He had a ton of like 1,200-yard seasons when that was uncommon. He had some black ink. He led the league in receptions with 116 in 1999. He was carrying offenses that were largely productive because of him, rather than somebody who, like, there's a lot of other pieces in place and he's kind of enjoying the rising tide lifting all boats. Like, he was the rising tide that was lifting boats. In terms of peak, he had, to my mind, the best receiver game in NFL history against the 2000 Baltimore Ravens. He had 15 catches, 291 yards, and 3 touchdowns in regulation against the 2000 Baltimore Ravens. They only allowed, I have to look up, I think he had like a third of all of the touchdowns passes they allowed all year in this one regulation game. Yeah, so Baltimore that year, opposing points allowed, 0, 0. Here's how many points they allowed in their 16 games: 0, 0, 0, 0. 4 shutouts, 3 more games with 3 points allowed, 4 more games with 7 points allowed. So we're now up to 11 out of their 19 games, including playoffs. They allowed 1 score or fewer. They allowed a 9-point game, 1, 2, 3 more 10-point games. So we're now up to like 14 of their 19 games, 10 points or fewer. They allowed 14 against the Titans. They allowed 19 against the Dolphins. They allowed 20 against the Jets, 23 against the Titans. So the Titans played them well. Titans had their number. And then they gave up 36 points to Jimmy Smith and the Jacksonville Jaguars, absolutely running them ragged. And that was, that was kind of an aberration for Jimmy Smith. He didn't have a lot of explosive outbursts like that, but he was very consistent, and he had that kind of potential when Jacksonville was throwing enough, because they weren't a very high volume passing team. He also almost became the first receiver in history with 50 yards in every single game of the season. I think he had like 49 in every single game of the season one year. So he was very consistent. It didn't matter who was playing across from him. He played with Keenan McCardell. He played without Keenan McCardell. It didn't matter who was throwing the ball to him. He played with Mark Brunell. He played without Mark Brunell. It didn't matter who the running back was. He was going to show up and do Jimmy Smith things. And when you adjust production for like the circumstances of the offense, and especially for how often that offense is throwing, his career numbers, despite doing basically nothing until after his 27th birthday, are really remarkable. He was one of the most productive receivers of all time when you account for the fact that his offense never threw the ball, and he's still getting 1,200 yards year after year after year. Yeah, again, I don't think he necessarily had the peak of a Steve Smith or a Larry Fitzgerald. It's kind of the Frank Gore problem, where he played a long time and was very, very good. I think Jimmy Smith was better as a receiver than Frank Gore was as a running back. I think Jimmy Smith did have a stretch of time where he was definitely a top 5 receiver in the NFL. But it wasn't like a huge stretch. He was never really the number 1, number 2 guy. He was always kind of more that number 3, number 4, number 5 guy. He's not, like there were other guys kind of in that range. I don't know that he was like materially better than Rod Smith or Isaac Bruce. Bruce is in, Smith, Rod Smith will not make it. But I love, in terms of like the story of his career, that late start completely written off, and then just went on to be, and he retired, after a 1,000-yard season. He absolutely could have kept going. He had plenty left in the tank. He was showing no real signs of slowing down. I would have loved if he had gotten in when he had the opportunity over the last like 5 or so years. I kind of suspect now it's a little bit too late. And I'm not going to be, he's not one of those ones where I think it's like a great travesty where like, how is Jimmy Smith not in the Hall of Fame? He's not like a Del Schaffner or a Billy Houghton, 2 guys who like, how are they not in the Hall of Fame? It makes no sense whatsoever. But I would have liked to see him get in kind of when he had the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, looking at the list thus far of what we've gone over, for me, it would be Drew Brees, Steve Smith, and probably Larry Fitzgerald and Jimmy Smith would be my 4 that I feel like that we talked about today that I feel like would be in my top 4. And then after that, I'd probably put Marshawn Lynch in only because it's more favoritism than anything else. But I would say if I had to just pick 4 that I felt like these guys deserve to be in, it would be Breeze, Smith, Fitzgerald, and Jimmy Smith. And I would take Jimmy Smith over Rod Smith. I get the Rod Smith love. I would take Jimmy Smith over him pretty handily.
Yeah, I would too.
But Isaac Bruce, I'm with you. I would take Isaac Bruce before I take Jimmy Smith. But it's
I would take Jimmy Smith over Isaac Bruce, but I think they're kind of in the ballpark. Rod Smith too. Again, we're talking about like good stories. Rod Smith, the best undrafted receiver in NFL history.
Sure.
Unless you count Don Hudson, who came out before the draft. And then Rod Smith to me is one of those guys, or I was talking about the distinction between like a team's Ring of Honor and the Hall of Fame, where like the Rod Smith, to me, the most indelible moment of Rod Smith's career. He had the first and only 200-yard game of his career against the Falcons in a shootout loss. And he like refused to do interviews afterwards because he's like, all the press is going to want to talk to me is about the yards, and I don't give a shit. We lost. Like to me, it doesn't matter. I would have rather had 2 yards and 1. And players will say that because they know they're supposed to say that. But Rod Smith meant that. Yeah. He absolutely meant that. He would rather have 2 yards in a win than 200 yards in a loss. And he would say all the time, people would talk about Jerry Rice's stats. And he's like, why don't they track wide receiver wins? Like, how do I compare to Jerry Rice in terms of wide receiver wins? I want to climb that wide receiver wins leaderboard. And he 100% meant it. And for like a team's Ring of Honor, that is extremely meaningful. I in terms of like, if you're choosing a receiver to build a team around and to build a culture, we talk all the time about the importance of culture and to like help inculcate younger players in like how the game is meant to be played. I don't know that there's any receiver who played how the game was meant to be played more than Rod Smith that I can think of. But yeah, in terms of impact on the field and Hall of Fame, no question to me, Jimmy Smith. If I'm picking 4, I've got, Breeze and Fitzgerald, obviously no question. Steve Smith, no question. And then I don't know among the positions if I have a 4th who I would like pound the table for. There's a bunch of guys who I wouldn't really mind if they got in. Jimmy Smith, Phillip Rivers, Marshawn Lynch.
McCoy.
I probably wouldn't put McCoy in. Anquan Bolden, Torrey Holt, Jimmy Smith, obviously. I'm not mad if these guys are, I'm not going to argue against any of them, but I just don't feel very strongly that, the Hall of Fame is lessened as an institution if these guys don't make it.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm with you there. No, I just like the idea of Rod Smith being there as the greatest undrafted player ever because it just, because Jason,
one of the best blocking receivers of all time.
Yeah, and our buddy Jason would probably still take a drafted guy just on principle. So hey Jason, if you're listening, but no, I mean that's the. I'm with you. I can understand that. So we'll continue this. We'll look at probably let's see, tight ends, offensive linemen, defensive linemen, and linebackers next. And then, we'll do that next week and go from there. But you can check out.
And then we'll probably have to devote a whole episode to kickers because I know how much you like them.
I do. I think the whole Vinatieri Gary Anderson debate's going to be really rather fun. Though I'd rather just skip to special teams outside of kickers. Though they only have one on there right now. So, but we'll.
And it's the wrong one. I've got opinions on
I bet
special teamers in the Hall of Fame.
I bet you do. So you've always got opinions. That's why we have you on the show, and you're a good source of opinions and facts and theories. And we will check out more of Adam's work, Dynasty and Theory. You can look at his work on kickers if you must. Over at Football Guys. No, he does great work everywhere. And definitely check out the odds and ends. And we'll be back next week most likely. So thanks again for listening, everybody. Have a good week.